And I have to say, in Atlanta in 1990, in that regard, there was nowhere to go but up from the point of view of street environment. It was sad.
Mesdames et messieurs, the greatest festival of our contemporary society, the Olympic Games, is about to begin.
This is going to be close.
Oh! They're all completely gassed! They've given it everything on the global bucket! Oh, yeah! Go! Oh!
Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. But that is an Olympic championship.
Ready.
Hello, fans of Shukflistan, and welcome to another episode of Keep the Flame Alive, the podcast for fans of the Olympics and Paralympics. I am your host, Jill Jarris, joined as always by my lovely co-host, Allison Brown. Allison, hello, how are you today?
I think we're going to make it.
I think so, too.
I think there's actually going to be a Tokyo Olympics.
Woo!
Oh, I'm not going to jinx it, though.
People are there. Athletes are there.
I know we're getting all the Instagram and Twitter pics of what the village looks like and what the cafeterias look like and the training facilities, and athletes are showing us their test runs in the various venues. So we're really there.
It's exciting.
But we're not there.
Right. We're not there. I'm trying not to think about that. So I decorated the house yesterday.
Which I saw, which was fantastic. Now, we'll send out a picture because what is on the second floor?
Okay, so I have on the porch, we have our Pan Am weightlifting championships that were held in Chicago in maybe 2009. We have a USA Wrestling Olympic flag, courtesy of the dulcet tones of Jason Bryant. And then I got a Team USA banner. And then hanging from actually our third floor windows, but it hangs down to the second floor, are light pole banners from the Chicago 2016 bid. So when I lived in Chicago, the mayor then had auctions every year and would auction off different light pole banners. And I really wanted a 2016 set. And I really wanted fencing because Ben actually knew the fencer who was the model for it. And then I really wanted archery, but boxing was the only one I could get. So it's a double banner that's a boxer.
Well, it's very cool. And you are putting us all to shame.
Well, we're working on it. I still have to go through the box of decorations, and then there are like 2 party stores I need to go to.
Basically, my decorations are going to be, I might possibly stick like a multicolored ribbon in my hair.
Yeah, I know. I understand it. It was a lot to get this stuff out, too.
I am making the Jell-O, though.
Oh,
Went to
well,
the
there
grocery
you
store,
go.
got my 5 colors of Jell-O.
That we need pictures of.
Yeah, because I got to tell you, when you buy the blue Jell-O, the checkout girl looks at you a little funny.
All right. We have tons of Tokyo stuff coming later on in the show, including how you can play Keep the Flame Alive opening ceremonies bingo and how you can join our Tokyo 2020 Fantasy League. But first, today is the 25th anniversary of Atlanta 1996, so we are talking about the legacy of those games from the city planning perspective. We are joined by Randal Roark and Michael Dobbins, who, along with Leon Eplan, wrote the new book, Atlanta's Olympic Resurgence, How the 1996 Games Revived a Struggling City. During the Games, Randal was the Director of Planning and Design for the Corporation for Olympic Development in Atlanta for the design of public projects in preparation for the 1996 Centennial Olympic Games. Michael Dobbins was Atlanta's Commissioner of Planning, Development, and Neighborhood Conservation from just before the Games and for the following 6 years. We talked about the legacy of those games and how the city fared. Take a listen. Randal and Michael, thank you so much for being here. Your book, Atlanta's Olympic Resurgence, How the 1996 Games Revived a Struggling City, just came out. Let's talk a little bit first. You were both involved in the planning of the games. What were your roles in before, during, and after the games? Randal, we'll start with you.
Okay, let me start first. As you know, there's a third author who tragically passed away, Leon Eplan. All 3 of us had planning positions in different capacities before, during, and after the games. Leon was commissioner of planning for the city, actually in the 70s in the original 2 Maynard Jackson administrations. But came back in the 90s and was the primary author of the Olympic development plan for the city leading up to the Olympics. So he's the before. And I was hired in 1993, 3 years to go, as the planning director for the Corporation for Olympic Development Atlanta, which was the corporation the city set up to do most of the improvements outside the Olympic venues. And we did that up through implementation until that corporation, CODA, dissolved in 1997. And I'll let Mike take it from there.
Yeah, so I came to Atlanta in 1996 in June, about two and a half months before the Olympics. I was hired as the Commissioner of Planning, Development, and Neighborhood Conservation in the Bill Campbell administration. So I picked up and sort of took up the role at Leon. I supplanted Leon, and he and I dovetailed very nicely in the transition between all the work that he was doing and his advice and guidance on where things were and how to get things done. And that was very instrumental in the period that I had served as commissioner, which was about 6 years after that. And the department just by that time, you should be aware that my department included planning and zoning and building permitting and inspections and code enforcement and housing and community development and human services. So I had a big, expansive kind of a role.
So that means we went from about 1990 to about 2005 in capacity in one way or another, and that's the period we cover in the book that we loosely refer to as the Olympic period in Atlanta.
Which is interesting because the Olympic period really kind of is a lot longer than people think. Oh, people might remember the run up to the games, and then the games happens, and then people kind of forget until they go, oh, what happened at those games? But the plans that get set in place really have a long ways after the games to really realize some of them, correct?
Yes.
Correct. And really the book is really about that, the legacy that was left. And the period we cover is a little bit longer after the games than the run-up. And a city receives a bid about 5 years ahead of the game. So there's a full 5-year period of preparation for any city that wins a bid for the Olympics, for the Summer Olympics. I think that's true for Winter Olympics too.
In reading some of these plans that the city had, I don't know how you did some of this stuff in the amount of time that you had, to be quite honest, but that's going to get ahead of ourselves. I'm really curious, what was Atlanta, the city, like when it won the bid? So we're talking late 80s, 1990s. What was the city like for somebody living there or even in the surrounding area?
I'll take a shot. Mike probably has comments too. And we do start out covering that. That's the first chapter, really trying to introduce the city at that point and covering a lot of time leading up to it, because the city really was at a nadir of disinvestment, white flight, and problems. Actually had lost 20% of its population. And when I say city, I mean the center city jurisdiction, city of Atlanta. The region is another animal which we should include in our discussion, but the city of Atlanta itself had lost 20% of its population, and most of that, you could say, was due to white flight, and that produced a lot of disinvestment downtown. So there were problems, and the Olympic bid, the award, could not have come at both a worse time and a better time, because it really provided a leverage point to begin to think about turning that around in a number of ways. Mike, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think what it was like was a city with broken sidewalks, empty storefronts, no trees, no attention to sidewalks or any travel modes other than, and no white people riding on MARTA, that kind of thing. And it was, and as Randy said, we lost 100,000 people from 1970 to 1990, 500,000 to 400,000. and it was a pretty rough place. A lot of empty storefronts. Georgia State University was basically a walled bastion. Georgia Tech was a walled bastion. There was no interconnectivity between them and the city they lived in. And I think, as Randy and I have talked about, I hope it comes out clearly in the book. What was interesting was that ACOG, which is the private sector initiator of the Olympics, basically saw this as a series of venues, whether they were hotels or sports events or whatever. They really didn't have a concept about connecting these venues together, how to get people to them, what that experience would be like, and so on. And so, starting with Leon's Olympic development plan, there was a lot of attention given. Okay, we're planners. We're about connectivity. We need to figure out how all these things that hadn't really been thought about are going to connect. And as I agree with you wholeheartedly, sort of reviewing all this, it was stunning that Randy and Claire Axum, his boss, and Coda were able to accomplish what they were able to accomplish in a city governmental structure that was not particularly smooth or functional at the time. Somehow got that done, and got it done for a remarkably small amount of money. I was just getting here when that work was wrapping up, and having now been in Atlanta for 25 years, I would really amplify your comment somehow. That activity, and basically what it did was transform the public canvas of our city from one that was really off-putting and dirty and unpleasant and sunbaked, no trees, to one that began to really transform the whole character of the downtown and as the book says, sort of later on Midtown and on the east side, where the ripple effect of the attention that Coda and Randy were able to accomplish began to sort of have impacts that I think accelerated regrowth and redevelopment, and taking advantage of the new demographics that were simultaneously, coincidentally, and serendipitously occurring, where people were beginning to say, it might be all right to live downtown. I'm actually living in one of only two buildings that house residents in the downtown of Atlanta at the time. So it's sort of across the board. Another aspect of that, which is in the book, and Randy can speak a lot more to, is a very robust, vigorous, reasonably well-funded public arts program that really shifted people's attitudes and ideas about what Atlanta could be.
Actually, it wasn't funded at all. We stole money from every other pot we could find to make it work.
I don't know if there's a statute of limitations on that. One of the things you both mentioned in your answer was race and the question of race, that white flight was an issue in Atlanta. And then within the bid itself, there was a large Black community, white business, and government leadership. So let's talk a little bit about the racial tension, both in the city and in the economic development of the Olympic Park.
Well, of course, there was always tension, but Atlanta also was, as you might remember, called the city too busy to hate. And it did develop a loose and sometimes uneasy alliance between that white business structure and the Black leadership to get some things accomplished, although a lot of times it was difficult going. And that Black political leadership was in place since 1973, when Maynard Jackson was the first Black mayor elected in a large city in the South. So that coalition was not non-existent. It just was loose and sometimes difficult. But the communication was enough there for that process to begin to, at least sit down in the same room and try to figure out how this was going to happen. And of course, the reality of a world event coming to your city in 5 years helps that along pretty well. You're really faced with a deadline that doesn't change, So everybody got busy. That whole process, a lot had been done in the 80s through the two administrations of Andy Young's tenure, who was the mayor preceding the Olympic bid. But that didn't really stop the disinvestment and the flight from the city, and that was still rather strong at the time. At the same time, you had a real explosion in Black arts and culture, and as well as political leadership. So those elements were all really quite strong in 1990 when we were at a bad spot. So there was a lot to turn around, but there was also a lot in place, which made it a little bit easier to get going in that period of time.
Yeah, I think it's the racial history of Atlanta is racial disparities, the lack of racial equity and patterns that actually can lead toward racial equity have been a long story of fits and starts, probably more fits than starts. And that's even true, I think, now. We still are uncovering and finding the depths of impacts. It isn't just Atlanta, it's every city in the country has sort of witnessed very frankly and openly both federal, state, and local discriminatory practices in jobs and housing and lending and banking and all that kind of stuff. One of the great things about what's happened over the last year is, gee whiz, we're shining light on something that we turned the light off back in the 60s. And it hadn't really come back. And now we're seeing all this revitalization of Jim Crow ideas and Jim Crow notions, and it's a long way from over. What Randy's point, I think, is important is that the Black business and political leadership is very, very conscious of what they need to do and are well organized to continue to press. You might recall that Georgia actually voted for Biden, and Georgia also voted for Warnock. So, and that that's on the TV every night. Stacey Abrams, who actually was an assistant attorney in the law department when I was in the city hall, and then of course she's risen to be. She was the Speaker of the House, the State House, and so on. So, a very, very accomplished person, and. In my view, the way to break this stuff down, I'm just speaking from my own perspective. Yes, there is white supremacy, and yes, there are people with a whole lot of money that are going to make sure that as best they can that it remains or even strengthens. And that's the struggle we're in. We were in the struggle then. We were coming out of the 60s and 70s stuff, and the city had made a lot of improvements to try to break down the barriers, but there's a long way to go, and there's still a long way to go.
I should mention there's really, in addition to the Black political leadership and the strong white business community, there's really a third leg to the coalition, and that was a very strong neighborhood movement that had emerged in the 70s of neighborhoods all around downtown, both Black and white, and some mixed by that point. But they were already strong, and they became even stronger in the face of possible construction of venues, stadiums, and other things that, got their attention. And so they were a very strong voice from the very early planning of the Olympics and had a voice. So there was a kind of third element to the kind of dance that was required to get us, to the opening ceremony. And they were major players.
I was just going to say, one of the things that you mentioned in the book, there is the myth that a lot of residential neighborhoods were bulldozed for venues. And that was a myth.
Yeah, not any. Because there was enough vacant opportunity for that to happen. Where that comes from is largely from the Centennial Park process, because Centennial Park also involved demolition of an older, lower density merchandising, warehousing, office district downtown. And it had very few, if any, residences at the time. And there were some in that area, and for whatever reason, there was a sense that people were being displaced for that project as well, which was right in the middle of downtown as well. But to my knowledge, I don't think any of the major venues had any displacement occur. They were all university situated or commercial district situated or already on sports related land or whatever the case may be. Mike, I don't know if you recall,
Well,
but I don't
Centennial
think
Olympic Park, and first of all, I don't think there was any residential displacement that occurred as a result of the Olympics. The link that people have drawn is that the housing authority, which had been in a troubled state by HUD for many years, initiated separately but linked, obviously because of the time frame, to demolish and replace the housing project that lies between downtown and Georgia Tech, and to create what is now called Centennial Place using HUD monies called Hope 6, which is administered at the time by, guess what, the governor of New York State. Andrew Cuomo came down here and it was his program and he dealt with it and so on. But as Randy says, the people who actually, the Olympic projects did not displace existing residents, except in a limited way. The Olympic Village adjacent to the Georgia Tech campus, the land for that particular project had been purchased by the existing housing, by the housing authority, and sort of offered to use that land when they were already into a major rehabilitation program that had been approved earlier, and they actually scuttled that and replaced it with the Hope 6 program. So
that project, by the way, was the first public housing project in the country, built in 1934, and a lot of it was vacant by that time, and that is true. There were those two blocks that were dedicated over to the high-rise component of the village. That's correct. But then the entire project was redeveloped, as Mike said, as a Hope 6 mixed-use, mixed-income project. And all of the public housing projects, of which there were many, 6, I think, surrounding downtown, during that same period were also reimagined and redeveloped as mixed-income neighborhoods, and almost all of them demolished and rebuilt. And so that may have played into the displacement story, but that was a separate process parallel to the Olympics.
It's also important to point out that one of downtown's great assets was lots of surface parking lots. Most of Centennial Olympic Park was surface parking lots. And I agree with Randy, nobody was displaced. There were some small shops and so on, businesses that were purchased, but there weren't any residents in that area. And there weren't that many businesses. I mean, I don't remember we have a photograph in the book about that or not. But actually, the story on that's kind of interesting because what I've heard from Central Atlanta Progress is that Billy Payne and the Central Atlanta Progress folks were all looking out across. It sort of dawned on them that, you know what, we don't have a central gathering place for these games. And we ought to worry about that. And they're looking down from the 10th story of a building, looking over Centennial. There's our space. And that's what prompted it. And then the World Congress Center, which is a state agency, went about acquiring it and developing it, and still are. And it's still very active, very vital activity. I just drove by there a few minutes ago.
Yeah, it actually belongs to the state of Georgia.
But the Center for Civil Human Rights is there, and the World of Coke is there. Of course, this is Atlanta, and the aquarium is not only there but has grown substantially. They got a whole lot of new sharks, which I'm going to have to go check out.
That's one thing about the park, the Centennial Olympic Park, was it did include additional area for redevelopment after the Olympics at the edge of and surrounding the park, which included those major facilities that Mike just listed, in addition to some housing. All occurred in the wake of the Olympics, actually, after the park was in and the games were over.
I'm glad you brought up the strong neighborhood groups, because that's a theme throughout your chapters, Randall, that the strength of the neighborhood groups that you had to work with. And the Olympics covered a lot of neighborhoods. But one of the stories I was interested in learning more about was the building of Olympic Stadium and the protests that happened, and then the working that working together you did to come up with solutions to get the neighborhood buy-in.
That actually, all of that happened in detail before CODA was formed, and I was not involved. I don't think I can give you the full story, although some of it is recounted in the book. And there was a lot of negotiation there, and a lot of it had to do with jobs for construction and the degree to which construction demolition would take place, and all the aftermath of taking advantage of the Olympic stadium construction that the neighborhoods negotiated a piece of, and that brought about, I think, the buy-in ultimately. The stadium itself, of course, was right adjacent to the Fulton County Stadium, the home of the Braves and Falcons at the time. And so it too did not displace any residential, but the impact of a stadium of that size certainly got everybody's attention and brought about the negotiations.
Yeah, I can comment directly. I know the three gentlemen who worked together to put the heat on ACOG to assure that jobs be provided for the construction of the stadium. Columbus Ward, who was the president of the Peoplestown neighborhood, Stuart Acuff, who was AFL-CIO North Atlanta, and Vincent Fort, who has been in the state senate and been an activist for a long time. And basically, they were ready, and they had sort of phalanxes of neighborhood people and activists ready to move on to the construction site in the event that they were not able to bring about the and of course that was the groundbreaking for the Olympic Stadium. It would have had national and international, probably some degree of coverage, and they used that to basically pressure ACOG. And actually, at that time, Shirley Franklin was the sort of community outreach link. She's subsequently the mayor. I don't know, you don't know Atlanta history, but anyway, they were ready. They had 50 at a time ready to move. They assumed that they would be arrested, so they had 50 people ready to pitch tents on the site, and they assumed that if those 50 got arrested, which they thought they would, then the next 50 would move in and occupy the site, and then the next 50 and the next 50. And my understanding is they negotiated all night long, and finally they got 150 jobs promised, where there wouldn't be a restriction of, ban the box, where criminal records and drug use would not be an obstacle to hiring, provided that whoever was accused or found to be abusing drugs or committing a crime would be off the scene. But so it was a well-organized thing. And going back to the neighborhood structure, I think a little history there is really important, because the strong neighborhood structure in Atlanta is nearly unique in this country. And it was basically Maynard Jackson and Leon Eplan who put it in place. I happened to be also the planning director in Birmingham in an earlier life. And Birmingham was one of the other cities that put strong emphasis on neighborhood-directed planning, design, development policy. And so that we call it the neighborhood planning unit system. There are 25 of them, only 24 at that time. But they were, they were recognized in law by the city. They had roles and responsibilities. They didn't have approval, but they had recommendation roles, and they have played a very significant role throughout the development. And then the question is whether the administration is going to listen to what neighborhoods are saying they want and need, or whether they're going to figure out a way to duck around it. And we've gone up and down in that response between. But when I was there, Mayor Campbell, following Mayor Jackson, were wholly committed to paying attention and trying to listen to citizen guidance, not just on the Olympics, but on zoning changes and budgets and all kind of things, small projects. And so and not many other cities have that.
Another side story relative to the neighborhood movement was the neighborhood movement grew and really cut its teeth on the fight over the freeways in the late 60s and early 70s. And then over the long negotiations, 20 years of negotiations over the right-of-way that had been stopped and abandoned for the freeway after demolition had taken place. And there were 6 or 7 neighborhoods involved there, and they really became awfully well organized and really helped to move the entire neighborhood movement along, so that when the Olympics came along, the neighborhood movement was really quite strong, and they had been very active for 20 some odd years. And part of that was the actual organization set forth in the neighborhood planning unit program of the 70s that Mike was talking about.
Freedom Park is interesting. It seems like it's got, like you said, decades of time taking to get to a stage where you get some of the park. And it sounded like during your time and working with the Olympics that part of the park got done. And then since then, part of the continuing legacy is finishing the park, which looks pretty amazing.
It's a saga. And it took a long time because even though the freeway was stopped, the Department of Transportation wouldn't let go of the right-of-way. And it took 20 years of negotiating and legal hassles and issues about whether the property should be returned to the people that owned the property to begin with before it was confiscated. So that caused it to drag out a long time. And I'm actually very familiar with the saga because Maynard Jackson hired me to do the first concept plan in 1973 of the Freedom Park. And in those days, it was referred to as Great Park. And there were several plans done along the way. But then when the Olympic period came and Leon was back in the saddle, he raised the money to do a full master plan for Freedom Park because he had finished the negotiation with the Department of Transportation to actually get a hold of the right-of-way if they agreed to build a smaller parkway around the Carter Center. The Carter Center being part of the saga because it came in the 80s when the right-of-way was there and the negotiations were going on, and President Carter was able to negotiate for land for his library and Center for Social Change in the middle of that park. So it's happened in very small increments over a long period of time. And so when COTA was formed, I inherited the master planning process for Freedom Park. And we got the master plan done, and we had a very small, in the scheme of things, grant of $1 million to implement a very rudimentary first phase, which put a major trail in and really kind of cleaned up that area before the Olympics. It was really not a park yet to speak of, but it has become one. It's like 200 and some odd acres. And I think the largest new park built in the United States in the second half of the last century. And going strong, a conservancy formed after the Olympics and has really taken over management of the development. And there's still phases to go to complete it.
I think the significance of what Randy just recounted in the Olympics is there's a fair chance that if the Olympics had not been coming, he would not have been so much able to really move as far as we did. And that was true of a lot of projects in downtown Atlanta. The recognition is sort of, and I have to give credit to the ACOG group because they really put a whole lot of, they really raised the citywide awareness of this thing coming. And that allowed us in the bureaucracy to be able to also sort of join on with that wave as a way of getting our different departments to do things, and more importantly, getting the private sector partners to do things that they may not have had any interest in collaborating without the deadline, the absolute deadline. Both the one thing I think and I was in meeting after meeting after meeting right after I got here, and there was obvious and palpable sort of uneasiness between the sort of neatly dressed white guys and our city administration. I was one of only two white guys in our cabinet, for example. The other guy ran the jail, so that pressure of time forced collaborations that probably would have been talked about, but probably wouldn't have happened if we hadn't had that absolute deadline. We had to meet. We were both, everyone in the room was committed to meeting the deadline, and that meant that a lot of people had to come off of their, maybe overly rebellious ideas or their over self-serving kind of ideas, and that was actually pretty cool.
You ask in your written questions what would have happened of the projects that were done that if the Olympics had not gone on. I might address that. A lot of them were on the docket. A lot of them had plans done. A lot of them were in discussion. Many of them were not. Many of them were fresh with the Olympics. So you could say a lot of that was in the works, but it would have taken a lot longer because the coalition hadn't coalesced, let's say, as it did prior to the Olympics. And the funding, of course, was, straggling and struggling. So a lot of that just came together as happens in preparation for an event like this. And it happened in a hurry as opposed, happened quicker than it might have because of the pressure and the interest surrounding the games.
And the marker of the success of those projects was the streetscape and smaller park developments that COTA was able to accelerate and get done. I think the idea of having a competition to fix Peachtree Street goes back into 1991, and the guy who won the competition was a friend of mine. And the project really accelerated when the Olympics was announced, and somehow Randy and his cohorts were able to actually get it installed. And basically it set a whole new standard for what a street ought to look like. Started downtown, Midtown has extended it, Buckhead has extended it, Auburn Avenue has extended it. It's become sort of the model for how we improve streets. And a lot of that's been going on, continuing to go on. It's going on more and more places.
And I have to say, in Atlanta in 1990, in that regard, there was nowhere to go but up from the point of view of street environment. It was sad. A lot of broken sidewalks, a lot of narrow sidewalks, and a lot of on-street parking that some of which was needed and some of which perhaps didn't have to be there. And street trees non-existent, street signage non-existent. It was pitiful. Street lighting spotty. It was embarrassing. It was so bad. And so one of the things we did was we tackled that. For one reason, we tackled it because that was what COTA was formed to do officially, because when ACOG set the plan for the venues, only one of them really was sitting directly on a MARTA rapid transit station. And everyone knew that people would be arriving by transit and would be having to walk to a lot of those venues between transit station and venue. And so 5 pedestrian corridors were envisioned by the city and by ACOG to make the connections between transit and venue. And when COTA was formed, those were the only projects that we were handed and told that this is what we had to do. And so we began with that charge, and we expanded it to, I think, 10 corridors and 12 miles of streetscapes downtown, and just pushed that idea because it had a lot of support. We found funding. There was some federal funding in place, and we were able to transform the whole culture of street environment really kind of overnight because of the press of the Olympic pedestrian need. Of course, after all, having said all of that, they closed the streets anyway between the venues and the transit stations because there were so many people. The whole street was closed to carry the pedestrian traffic.
One of the things that under Leon's commissionership, he had one of his staff was a woman named Allison Whidden, and they came up with this idea that we had all these vacant parking lots all over downtown. And they came up with the idea, okay, we're going to require the owners of those parking lots to plant trees, 1 tree for every 8 spaces. And that was litigated instantly. and lost, and litigated again and lost, and it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court refused to review the finding that, yes, the city has the ability to do that because it has stated in the comprehensive development plan that this is a goal. And that's another part of this, is the critical importance of having a comprehensive development plan that lays down policy that's clear enough and specific enough that it can begin to trump the sort of one-off development initiatives that whoever developer, Joe Q developer, wants to do this or that. So that was pretty cool. But the connectivity framework that Randy's projects were critical, and they've advised all kinds of stuff, and still are up and down the city. One thing that we bring out in the book is that the venues themselves, many of which sort of existed in one form or another as a basis for winning the bid, this city, both the housing, the venues, the connectivity framework, all still exists or has been transformed and upgraded. And that's fairly unusual among Olympic cities. You know, Athens and even Barcelona, to some extent, they have major Olympic venues that are standing empty or vacant or deteriorating. Sydney, the same thing.
One of the things that bugs me, I think, about anti-Olympics activists is the lack of knowledge that a lot of projects don't get started or don't have that impetus to get finished because of the Olympic deadline. And you've talked a little bit about some of the things that we wouldn't necessarily notice: sidewalks, trees, all of that is streetscaping. All of that may not have happened without the Olympics, or would have happened at a much slower pace. Correct?
Definitely true.
Right. Yeah.
2 bond elections. We had one in 1994, and we had another one in 1999 to continue the work. With the 1999 bond referendum in Atlanta was rather stunning in a number of ways. First of all, before the 1994 bond referendum, bond issues had been routinely failing. And the 94 one won, probably because the Olympics were coming, and I think the 99 one was approved by 85% of the electorate, when the mayor was not a very popular guy, particularly among white people. In fact, really only among white people. And it won by 85%. And that was to continue on with what we had started. We called it a quality of life bond election. And it passed and was approved. So it was not just setting up for the Olympics, but it was also public support funding for continuing the efforts that people felt were improving the quality of their lives.
What were some of the things that didn't work?
We had a palette of a lot of projects that we thought we could get done. And of course, we didn't know because the money wasn't there and the support wasn't there. But we pushed right ahead on all of them, thinking that we'd just keep pushing until it was very clear that the money and the time was not going to make it. And so it is simply, in the point of view of the amount that was required, amount of time, money, and support that was required, we had several projects drop away. Not really anything particularly wrong about them. There were a couple art projects that might have been controversial, but they were not particularly well. The funding didn't appear that it was going to be there anyway. But there were no major projects. And for me, the biggest disappointment, because the other half of CODA's agenda was neighborhood redevelopment. And we knew from the start that in 3 years, we weren't going to do a lot of redevelopment. It was absurd to think that. And we thought what we could do is change the culture of redevelopment and change the machinery, public machinery of redevelopment, and create a process that might be able to be continued. And so we did that, and we put in place that process, which Mike really picked up after the Olympics. But unfortunately, not a lot of actual redevelopment was done in the period leading up to the Olympics, except for the public housing redevelopment that we mentioned, and some scattered independent projects, scattered singular projects. All of the neighborhood plans were in place and passed and adopted, and which was our main goal, to make sure that was done before we left in 1997. So that was disappointing to me that we didn't get any further, but we did set the machinery up for it to continue. There were no big projects, construction projects that really didn't get done. I have to stop and think about that for a minute, that we actually started, that were on our plate to begin with. COTA there was a sunset provision in the development of COTA that we knew that it was going to dissolve in 1997. And a lot of people, it had enjoyed some success, and a lot of people didn't want that to happen, but there was a major transitional process that Mike oversaw, the Renaissance project under Mayor Campbell right after the Olympics, that picked up the energy of the Olympics and said, where is the city now, and what can we put in place to leverage what we've done going from a point of view of public policy. And then COTA did have a successor organization, a kind of super development agency that was established to pick up a lot of the same functions. So there was some continuity there, even though COTA itself was dissolved after the game.
We already had some locally based community development corporations, neighborhood initiatives that came out of the neighborhood that were supported through block grant funds. A number of others came to be. But the biggest disappointment, and keeping in mind that we had the reference of the push to get jobs into the community with the stadium, that's an idea that has come to be called community benefits. And that would be called a community benefit agreement in current parlance. That is, that if somebody's going to spend a bunch of money, what's in it for the people who are most impacted by it? And what does it do for the wealth divide? What does it do for the race divide? And so on. And that's my biggest disappointment, is that in 1970, we had about 500,000 people. In 1990, we had about 400,000 people. About 20% of those people, between 20 and 25% of those people, were living under the poverty line. So what happens right now? We still have 25% of the people in the city living under the poverty line. That's my biggest disappointment, is if we're going to do big projects, we've got to be very explicit about, those projects don't happen without a whole lot of governmental support, whether it's money or zoning or entitlements or different kind of things, or street improvements or whatever. And I get increasingly frustrated that where we really had teed up the idea of sharing wealth where it comes from, whether it's developer or some other private investment, and that there ought to be something explicit that redounds to the benefit of the people who are feeling the greatest need. And that pattern just simply hasn't gained ground. There have been a lot of people working to try to make something like that happen, and it's always a huge struggle. It's always resisted, particularly resisted by the ruling class, which is mostly white, but also resisted by existing laws. You all, I don't know how much you follow this kind of field, but there's sort of a national debate going on about zoning laws and how the zoning laws are systemically racist and discriminatory, and a lot of jurisdictions all over the country are trying to deal with that, including Atlanta. And it seemed like now we have a big investment binge going on. The city's doing great, and all kind of stuff coming on. Georgia Tech's transformation, which we get into the beginning of in the book, is now we got Microsoft coming to the west side of Atlanta and Amazon coming to the west side of Atlanta, big acres project. And actually, I'll be teaching this fall my students about how do we work to inculcate values that are community driven, of community need, and make sure that before we give away the store, we get something back for it that actually improves a lot of the people who are there. You've heard about displacement and gentrification. Those are issues that are really taking off in the areas where Microsoft and Amazon are beginning to fund. And there are a lot of local groups that are working, some of them fairly effectively, about trying to implement this. So we need to have the private sector to come along and recognize that the spiraling wealth divide that is occurring in Atlanta, we're the city worst off in terms of the division between rich and poor in the country. And we were then, and we still are, and that's a great frustration for me. And it's the kind of thing that you can deal with almost block by block, or you can deal with it by policy overview and all that kind of thing. But I'm still working at it.
You all asked a question about Olympic finances and ticket sales and that sort of thing, which we cover somewhat in the book, which is an interesting, quick story. What we point out in several places in the book that in the context of the Olympic movement, the Atlanta Games are really something of an anomaly. In fact, a big anomaly. And when you look at it from the point of view of money spent, it really was the cheapest Olympics in the last 50 years, largely because Billy Payne and ACOG said it was going to be. They were going to be efficient with their investment. They were going to break even. There was not going to be any public debt. And lo and behold, all that was true in the end. They spent a little under $2 billion. And then another billion. We've analyzed it for this book, and we've added another billion to the cost that came from other sources that were improvements that really had to happen by the Olympics, and that included what COTA did. So the total cost of the games was about $3 billion. And you compare that with, at the other end of the spectrum, Beijing, which we think was somewhere around $50 billion and maybe more. And that comes a lot when you have major autocratic governments, investing in the games on a national level. And in the United States, we almost always are pursuing doing the Olympics on some form of private formula of one kind or another. It is actually kind of interesting that the federal government did an audit on the 3 games that happened in the States in the last 20, 30 years, Los Angeles, Salt Lake City, and Atlanta. And there actually was quite a bit of federal investment. It just wasn't always direct. It was indirect across a whole lot of agencies and different funding programs and so forth. And that was the case in Atlanta as well. As some $600 million of federal money was invested in the games. But the other half of that formula that we point out in the book, which surprised me, was among all of those Olympic Games in the last 50 years, Atlanta sold the most tickets and had the highest attendance. And at the same time was the cheapest. So you have to analyze those two things separately, probably. Atlanta was in the middle of the United States. It was easy to get to by car and by plane, and a lot of people came because they could. And the tickets weren't too bad. And so a whole lot of people were here for the Olympics. And so the attendance was very high. Most games sell and generate about 8 to 9 million tickets. I'm not sure what Rio did, but that was the case. London sold just about the same number as Atlanta, but all the others were quite a bit smaller. A lot of the more remote, from a world point of view, Olympics, people buy the tickets, but they really don't come because it's a difficult thing to do. For example, Sydney, great Olympic Games, but it was not a full house because of accessibility as much as anything else. So it's the cheapest games and the most well-attended games. And it broke even. And there were small but catalytic investments around the city. So what we call in the book, we call it small ball Olympics, which is maybe a good formula or a good model, maybe for Olympic movement going forward, where the Olympics has become ridiculously expensive and almost pricing itself out of existence, in addition to all the other problems the movement has, that it can actually be put on for a smaller investment and still have a big impact. And so one of the reasons we wrote the book was to point that out, that the kind of contribution that Atlanta made to the Olympic movement as an anomaly in the Olympic movement. And we wanted to make sure that was part of the book.
Last question here, but how do people think of the Atlanta Olympics today in Atlanta?
Well, I tell people here in Florida, I'm writing a book about the Olympics, and the first thing I want to talk about is the bombing, saying that's what most people want to talk about because of the most highly visible event, and it was tragic. And, of course, it was certainly covered heavily. Second thing that people remember were the tawdry commercial spectacle of all the vending tents and it was awful. It was not regulated, and the vendors ended up not even making very much money, and it looked bad, and the world press didn't like it at all, and none of us liked it either. And I even likened in the end, the spectacle of the Atlanta Olympics was more like the Texas State Fair than it was a Euro-centric elite sporting event, because it was rowdy and it was loud and it was rather tawdry, and on the other hand, it was fun and it was loud and it was rowdy, and everybody had a really good time. And the sports events came off very well managed and well done. So you can look at it that way. In a way, it kind of emerged as kind of a people's Olympics as opposed to a kind of elite event. But the whole world was here and they saw it. And I think there were some things about the Olympics that didn't go well, at least from the point of view of the international press. And so a lot of people remember those things. But we wanted to, in this book, make it clear that there were a lot of good things, in many cases, a lot of small good things, but they had the effect of creating a kind of sea change in Atlanta in-town culture that I think is held pretty well in the 25 years since.
It's interesting, and your question is that doing little things positively, incremental development guided by a systematic set of plans and continuity of a planning effort are not the kind of things that get headlines. You got to have a big splash. You got to have a big name superhero architect come on. By the way, Randy and I are both architects. And if you don't do that, you're not going to catch the sort of innate elitism that accompanies the Olympics. I grew up in the state that you guys, I'm sure if I were to pose you this question, you could guess where I grew up. It was the only state that took a state referendum to reject getting the Olympics.
Oh, you grew up in Colorado.
Thank you. You knew. Okay. And so I think it's interesting too, in the local, I think the race issue comes up in the subsequent response. People whom I've known a long time and have known well and have generally respected termed the Olympics in Atlanta as the city having lost the opportunity. Now, when you've grown back 100,000 people and you've attracted successive greater and greater investment, albeit without the proper sort of distribution of the benefits of those investments, how can they possibly still think of it as being a lost opportunity? And the only thing I can come up with is it's a racial view. The mayor we had during that time is actually the mayor in place when all this stuff was happening, a guy named Bill Campbell, was not... How would you characterize his reception among the whites community, white business leadership, Randy? You got a way to comment on that, or
not popular?
and you know that coloring of the cities and its activities will continue on for some time. It has a lot to do with, it's not just the city, but cities everywhere in light of the re-revelation of the discrimination that's been visited upon Black people, people of color, people of divergent viewpoints, systemically. It's built into the laws and so on and so forth. And frankly, I think the Olympic movement has depended and had been literally dependent on having a lot of billionaires from a lot of different countries and sort of expressing a kind of an elitist perspective. And I think that might be why some people are resistant to it.
Thank you so much, Randal and Michael. Their book is available for purchase in our bookshop.org storefront at bookshop.org/shop/flamealivepod.
Welcome to Shukflistan.
The dulcet tones of Jason Bryant are in Fargo, North Dakota, announcing the Junior and Under 16 Nationals tournament, which is kind of like his warm-up before he goes over to Tokyo.
You got to have a test event. Ice dancer Charlie White spoke to the Peninsula Skating Club, and that Zoom is still online, so we will have a link to that in the show notes.
Decathlete Jordan Gray will be competing in a women's decathlon at the College of San Mateo on August 21st and 22nd.
so much to talk about.
So much to talk about. Before we talk about Tokyo news, we need to thank our patrons first. Our patrons help make this show possible with their financial contributions. We really appreciate what they do for us because it takes off some of the stress of putting on the show. If you are interested in contributing yourself, go to patreon.com/flamealivepod. Patreon is kind of an ongoing donation site. So if you are looking to make a one-time donation, hang on tight. We're going to have a Kickstarter during the games. But back to Tokyo news. The organizing committee is publishing daily lists of how many people have tested positive for COVID-19 and who has tested positive. Because, hey, guess what? People are testing positive for COVID. And also, guess what? The Olympic Village is not the sacred bubble that T-Bach thought it was going to be.
I mean, did he think that it was going to be like one of those sci-fi films where you pass through the invisible screen and it was going to wash you of all COVID germs?
Probably. But as of today, they've had 58 positive tests so far. 4 of those are athletes, 17 games concerned personnel, 5 media, 3 Tokyo 2020 employees, 29 Tokyo 2020 contractors. So really the bulk of the problems are in with the contractors.
Which you assume are not necessarily native Japanese, but certainly people who are already living in Japan.
Right, especially the Uzbekistan contractor who has been charged with sexual assault for an incident that happened at the National Stadium.
Did that send you into orbit like it sent me into orbit?
Yeah, it did. And then I kept wondering, no foreign fans, but we can have foreign contractors.
Yeah, we can have foreign rapists.
Yeah, that too. That does not stop everyone from showing up with masks on, including the Chinese delegation, because part of them arrived in Tokyo, and there was a video on Twitter where they not only had masks, they also had face shields or goggles, and then some of them were in hazmat suits. It was really kind of bizarre.
It was sort of like at the beginning of the pandemic when I saw this guy in my grocery store wrapped in a black garbage bag. And he had holes cut out for his eyes.
Wow.
So, as long as nobody shows up with the black garbage bag, I think we're okay.
Athletes and their the officials for different delegations are settling into the village. Tons and tons of stuff online about what's going on, how are the beds, here is the kit I have gotten. And like you posted on Instagram about Hemming Hu, who is Millie Tapper's doubles partner for table tennis, and just mesmerized by the bags of stuff he got.
He's very active on Instagram and posts lots and lots and lots of stories. So if you want to see what's happening in the Australian block, definitely follow Hemming Hu, and you will get some appearances by Millie Tapper. And he had the suitcase and how they were trying to sort through all the matching suitcases. So he called it like the biggest game of Where's Waldo, trying to find his own suitcase, because obviously they all matched. But yeah, they got, full wardrobes and all these shoes, and they have it all lined up. And just following the athletes on social media has been so much fun this time around, because of all the extra touches it feels like they're doing since they're going to be so isolated.
Exactly. And we have talked before with different athletes about how, yes, they get a lot of kit, but that kit has to kind of last them for a long time because they don't make money to buy their own clothes. The New Zealand team athletes got their own personalized, I might say this wrong, the Po'namu pendant, which is Maori tradition. It's a very important symbol in Maori culture, and that's when we've seen New Zealand athletes be very emotional about getting one, because that really means a lot to them. So that was really cool. What's not cool, if we could play cool and not cool, what was not cool was that the South Korean delegation, when they were decorating their balconies, because the village balconies are just being covered with flags and signs for different teams. They also put signs that had a historic reference to a past conflict with Japan on their balconies. And the IOC said, no, that's Rule 50. Take those down.
right? Because they considered it a political statement. And the funny thing was, it referenced like a 14th century naval battle. But apparently it was so obscure. But apparently it is something that South Koreans have, sort of like remember the Alamo kind of significance in South Korean culture, how this Korean, I guess, admiral defeated the Japanese. And I'm like, that's just sloppy, and it was. I mean, they had huge, this wasn't just some handwritten sign.
No, it was multiple balconies
Of these beautifully printed cloth banners. So I'm like, ooh, somebody was really making a point, and
Right.
It wasn't a good one. But the Olympics are apolitical.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, that said, Team Korea actually has a virtual house that you can visit, which is kind of interesting. We will have a link to that in the show notes and see. There's obviously no team houses this year that usually happen at games, but they are the ones that put on a virtual experience. So we will check that out for you. And weather, I've been tuning in a little bit to some of the press conferences that have been happening. And so the weather people are starting to talk, and it's hot. It's humid. The forecast for tomorrow is 92 degrees Fahrenheit with a real feel of 101. And so that would translate to 33 degrees Celsius with feeling of 36. So it is hot. It is humid. It might get a little bit cooler, but not much. So they're trying to take a lot of preparations and precautions with, especially with officials who have to be in the field a lot longer than athletes would or other staff. So there's a lot of cooling vests and misting and fans and things like that.
Speaking of cool, so Luca Jones, our canoe slalom athlete, posted that they go swimming in the water.
Oh, do they? That would be fun.
And apparently it is really cold.
That would be fun. It'd be like the widest water slide. Speaking of water, now that you said that, apparently Bloomberg reported that the marathon swim course area smells like a toilet. So the website Axios quoted Bloomberg in saying that there are big concerns about the pollution levels in Tokyo Bay, that's where the swimming portion of the triathlon is set to take place. And I'm not sure about marathon swimming, but at least there's going to be some swimming in here. Well, one of the athletes said it smelled like a toilet, and the problem is that wastewater and sewage combined with runoff all had to be treated before flowing into Tokyo Bay. And so I don't think that system works all the time.
Well, you know what we need to combine? What was the venue that had the oyster problem?
Oh,
because that's what one of the things oysters do is they do a very, very good job of cleaning water. So if we could combine those venues, we could solve two problems with one oyster.
there you go. So
Seriously, why do they not ask us?
I don't know. But I do remember back to Rio when we talked to, because the water there was an issue. But when we talked to Tessa Gobos, she said, yeah, we all jumped in after rowing and nobody, and I don't remember anybody getting sick from the water there either.
And I think a much bigger issue in terms of water were the green pools.
Mm-hmm.
So marathon swimming in a toilet doesn't sound so scary. Of course, I'm not the one doing it, but we won't discuss that.
Let's talk a little bit of opening ceremonies news. The musician Keigo Oyamada has stepped down as composer for the opening ceremonies after old reports of his bullying and abusive behavior resurfaced. So this is from Reuters. Apparently, he was a pretty big jerk when he was younger, and that has caught up with him, so he has resigned. No word on what that means, though.
Right, because if he's the composer, isn't he done?
Maybe he was also directing.
Oh, okay.
I mean, because that would make sense.
I hope the music's written.
Yeah, but which I didn't quite understand because, the whole so what happens?
So we have very few people who are still working on this opening ceremonies. We lost the artistic director. Now we've lost the musical director and is it going to be just like Mr. Smith and a drum going, "Yay, welcome to Tokyo"? Maybe they'll bring Mr. Bean back with his piano.
The IOC announced the recipient of its Olympic Laurel honor. I did not remember this from Rio. This is a new award that they started at the Rio opening ceremonies. It's to link the ancient Olympics and the focus on human development through peace and sport. So the person who is going to receive it this year is Bangladeshi Nobel Peace Prize winner Muhammad Yunus. And Yunus worked with the IOC on its Young Leaders Program, the Imagine Peace Youth Camp, and the Athlete 365 Business Accelerator. In the whole discussion and debate about fans being at the games, because T-Bach is still hoping that numbers will go down enough that, at least for the second... Yeah, I know you're shaking your head.
Again, we're all going to walk through the sci-fi bubble, and it's just going to wash all the germs away.
Yeah. So T-Bach is hopeful that numbers will go down and fans will be allowed in the games. So, our friend Carlos Grauman finally wrote an article about some athletes who were questioning why there are fans at sumo and at baseball, but the Olympics can't have any, which is something I keep bringing up. Because it does not make sense, and it doesn't seem fair that the Olympics are targeted, even though, and if you can have all these other sporting events or other concerts, I don't know what other kind of events are going on, but it can't only be sports in Tokyo. If they can have it, what makes the Olympics special about having a limited number of fans? Anyway, so there's that. There's going to be Tokyo closed the waterfront city venue area, which is going to have the cauldron and all the stuff. It was supposed to be a big public gathering place. That got closed. But our friend Roy Tomizawa noted that there are going to be some fans in certain competitions because there are going to be some football matches in Miyagi Stadium in Miyagi Prefecture because their governor really wants fans in the stands, so they will have about 13,000 there. Fans will also be allowed for football matches in Ibaragi and for cycling events at the Izu Velodrome in Shizuoka. Roy did note that this is subject to change, but right now that's where it stands.
Now, is this because they're all in different prefectures and
so.
Those prefectures are under different rules?
I believe so.
So it's sort of like here in the United States where New York had rules and literally a mile away in Connecticut, I had very different rules.
Yes, I believe that is correct. So you are talking about, yes, prefecture boundaries at this point. And seeing that the velodrome could be having fans makes me very happy because they're doing Kirin racing for track cycling, and that was developed in Japan. It is one of the 4 sports you can bet on legally in Japan. So I have a feeling that could be pretty crazy. People who are not allowed to go, family members of athletes. So Team USA paired with NBC Universal and a couple of other sponsors to fly athlete families and friends to a mass viewing party. So Rachel Bachman reported in the Wall Street Journal that they're going to fly 2 friends or family members per Olympian to an NBC Universal Resort in Orlando, where they'll get free round trip air, they get 4 nights hotel, a pair of 3-day passes to Universal theme parks, and then they get to go to the NBC Team USA Hospitality Lounge for dinner and Olympic viewing, and of course there will be cameras there for reaction shots. They're doing a second one for the Paralympics where they will fly those friends and family members to Colorado Springs, and they'll get tickets to the USOPC Museum and the Olympic Training Center and a hospitality lounge and watch party and all that. Same airfare, hotels. It was also noted in the article that if the Paralympic friends and family members wanted Universal theme park tickets because that's, you could weigh, USOPC museum versus theme park. They'd be able to get those at another date.
Well, because what is NBC coverage in the U.S. without family reaction shots?
Right.
I mean, we have 7,000 hours of coverage to fill. At least 2,000 or 3,000 of that is going to be, grandpa and mom, never mind husbands and wives and children. So they got to gather them together.
And speaking of viewing parties, since we can't all be together, all of us are going to have a virtual bit of fun. We are going to have virtual opening ceremonies bingo. So we will have a bingo card that is blank, and you will fill it out with, we'll have a list of buzzwords that you will likely hear at an opening ceremonies event. You fill out your own card with the buzzwords, and if you can black out the entire card, you will get a prize.
And no cheating. Fill out your cards ahead of time.
Exactly. Yeah. So there will be rules attached, but it will be take a photo of the card that you fill out and then take a picture of your blacked out card. And don't black everything out, just cross it out so we can still kind of see the word underneath it. But I have some Tokyo pins that I had for trading because I was supposed to be there. So I will be happy to share those with the top 3 winners.
And we're going to post that in the Facebook group?
In the Facebook group. If you are not on Facebook and would like to play, email flamealivepod@gmail.com and put bingo in the subject line. So we will get you a card ASAP.
But that's not all.
That's right. So Tokyo 2020 has a whole fan zone section. And part of their fan zone section is a fantasy league. So we have set up the Keep the Flame Alive podcast league, that if you would like to play Fantasy Olympics with us, please come and do so. So when you have to sign up for the fan zone, and they'll call that an Olympic ID, or you can log in with a Google account or something like that too. But create your Olympic ID and you log into the fan zone. Then what you want to do is join the fantasy section, and you will need this verification code to join the Keep the Flame Alive podcast group league. It is KMANXW5V. So that's K as in Kevin, M as in Michael, A as in Andy, N as in Nancy, X as in Xavier, W as in Walter, 5, V as in Victor.
And again, we will post that in the Facebook group. We'll probably put it on the Facebook page as well.
Right.
And if you have any problems, just email us, flamealivepod@gmail.com, and we will get it straightened out so that you can all laugh at me at how bad I do at fantasy sports.
So, and I'm still working on it. You pick rosters of athletes for every day. And
it's very detailed, but you could just be like me, throw some athletes in there, see how you do. Or you could be like one of those crazy people who like switches people up every day and makes it all perfect. But do you know what would help people build their fantasy team?
What?
Knowing who's competing each and every day. And do you know how they could find out who's competing each and every day?
Maybe with our new viewing guide ebook.
We have an ebook. So excited about this ebook. So we created an ebook. It is available on Amazon. We will have a link to that in the show notes. And it has each competition that's happening each day. It has the weeks at a glance. It has descriptions of the sports. We had a lot of fun putting it together, so you can get a copy of that as well.
Yes, Amazon.com. Look for Keep the Flame Alive on Amazon. The podcast is also on Amazon, but you can the viewing guide will be there as well. There are 2 things I really love about this ebook is that every day we have a chart that shows all of the sports and what times they are, so you can see what overlaps and what doesn't, and what's a medal sport and what's not a medal sport. So you can pick out if you really want to see a medal sport and there are 3 sports you love competing against each other, but just one's doing medals that time, you can figure out what to watch a lot easier. The other thing I love is that it also includes the Paralympics. So most of the Olympic guides that you see right now are Olympics only. This one also includes Paralympics, so you can prep now for those games.
We got some prepping to do.
yes, we do have some prepping to do, so we will get on it and call that a show. Hey, let us know your thoughts about Atlanta 1996. We'll get back to those games when we'll get back to our Atlanta 1996 history moments when all the Paralympics are over again. But it was really nice to be able to talk about them on the day of the 25th anniversary. I did put on Twitter the opening ceremonies cued right to the pickup truck section. So be sure to go back
Olympics,
and watch.
never forget.
I'm going to have to take 10 minutes and grab a box of Kleenex so I can watch Muhammad Ali lighting the cauldron again, because it's one of the best ones. But yes, let us know your favorite moments from those games.
Email us at flamealivepod@gmail.com or call or text us at 208-352-6348. That's 208-FLAME-IT. We're Flame Alive Pod on Twitter and Insta, and Keep the Flame Alive podcast group on Facebook.
One more show until the games. One more
And it's
show.
my favorite shows that we do.
Exactly. So we are having a contributor roundtable. Superfan Sarah and Book Club Claire will join us to talk about what we're looking forward to most. So join us Thursday for that, and then Friday the games start.
Get some sleep while you can.
Exactly. As we go out to music by Mercury Sunset, thank you so much for listening, and until next time, keep the flame alive.
Sometimes you think that life is just a journey, an endless search for meaning you'll never find. And I never had a reason, but I always had a feeling that it will break me if I go. So take me back to Tokyo, and it will break me if I go. So take me back to Tokyo, and it will break me if I go. So take me back to Tokyo, just to see her face.
You and we? Yes, you and we. It sounds horrible, but that's grammatically correct. We can.
Well, just we.
Oh,
Why
all
are
of
they
us
you
together.
and we? Why aren't we just we? We compete in Reco Car.